Hard work is the most praised trap ever built for a human being. I do not say that to shock you. I say it because I watched it destroy men who deserved better, men with real ability and real intention, men who did everything society told them would produce a good life. They worked from before sunrise to after dark. They sacrificed rest. They sacrificed time with people they loved. They wore the exhaustion like a badge and they called it virtue. And they died with almost nothing to show for decades of it. I am Henry Ford. I built one of the greatest industrial companies in history. And I am going to tell you exactly what hard work actually is, why it has been sold to you as the path to wealth when it is almost the opposite, and what the men I watched build real things actually did instead. The answer is going to make some people uncomfortable. Stay with me, because the distinction I am going to draw in this message is the one that separates the men who work their entire lives from the men who build something that keeps working after they stop. I am Henry Ford. I built the Ford Motor Company from a shed behind my house on Bagley Avenue in Detroit. I built the Model T, which put the world on wheels. I built the moving assembly line, which changed how every factory on earth operates. I paid my workers $5 a day when $2 was the going rate, reduced their working hours, and made more profit for doing it, not less. I did none of this through hard work in the sense most people mean the word. I worked. Every person who builds anything real works. That is not the point. The point is the difference between effort and direction, between the quantity of work and the quality of what the work is aimed at, between working hard and working on the right thing in the right way. Most people have been taught that effort is the primary input to success. More effort, more success. Less effort, less success. This equation is simple, memorable, socially endorsed, and almost completely wrong for anyone whose goal is to build something beyond a wage. In this message, I am going to explain exactly what the hard work trap is, where it comes from, and how it keeps intelligent and sincere people in exactly the position they are trying to escape. And then I am going to give you the specific alternative that actually produces results, not inspiration, a specific mental shift and a specific daily practice that changes what your effort is aimed at before it changes how much of it you are giving. Listen to this every day. The man who hears it once recognizes something. The man who hears it 30 times starts making different choices. Let me describe the belief first, because you need to see it clearly before you can see what is wrong with it. The belief goes like this: wealth and success are the reward for suffering. The more you suffer through work, the more you deserve the reward, and the more likely you are to receive it. Rest is a form of theft from your future. Comfort is a warning sign. If you are comfortable, you are not working hard enough. And if you are not working hard enough, you will not build anything worth having. This belief is extremely old and it is extremely widespread. It is taught in families, in schools, in churches, in the culture of every industry I have ever been part of. It is presented not as a strategy, but as a moral principle. The hard-working man is good. The man who is not working hard is bad. And this moral framing makes the belief nearly impossible to examine critically, because to question whether hard work leads to wealth is to risk sounding like you are endorsing laziness, which no one wants to do. I want to question it anyway, because the evidence, looked at honestly, does not support the belief. The hardest working people in my era, and in every era I know anything about, were not the wealthiest. They were among the poorest. The men who broke their bodies in the foundries and the mines and the fields, who worked 12 and 14 and 16-hour days with no days off for years at a stretch, produced the labor that built the wealth of others while accumulating almost none of it themselves. This is not because they did not deserve better. It is because effort alone, without direction and leverage and system, does not compound. It produces a wage, and a wage is not wealth. Wealth is what you have when your output exceeds your effort, when the system produces more than you personally put in, when the thing you built keeps running after you step back from it. No amount of personal effort alone produces that result. You need something else entirely. And the hard work trap is what keeps most people from finding it, because the hard work feels like the right answer and no one around them is suggesting otherwise. My father worked harder than almost any man I knew in my early life. He woke before dawn. He worked the farm through heat and cold with real physical commitment. He asked no favors and gave no excuses. He was the kind of man that the hard work belief holds up as its ideal example. And by the time I was old enough to understand what I was looking at, I could see clearly that the farm produced enough to sustain the family from year to year and almost nothing beyond that. Not because my father was not capable, not because the land was poor, because the farm was a machine that converted effort directly into survival with no multiplication, no system, no leverage. More effort in produced, more output out, roughly proportionally, and the man in the middle was the converter. He was the machine. My father was not a machine. He was an intelligent man who had been placed by circumstance into a role where his intelligence was almost entirely irrelevant and his effort was almost entirely the variable. Work harder, eat slightly better. Work less, eat slightly worse. There was no amount of working harder that would have fundamentally changed the structure of what the farm produced. The structure was the constraint, not the effort. When I was 16, I left the farm and went to Detroit to work for wages. My father thought this was a mistake. He believed that working for another man was a form of dependency that a serious man should avoid. In one sense, he was right. Working for wages is dependency on someone else's direction. But it was a different kind of dependency than the farm, because working for wages in the city placed me inside a system much larger than what the farm could provide. And inside that larger system, there was enough room to observe, to learn, to identify what produced results beyond effort, and eventually to build something of my own. I tell you about my father not to criticize him. He was a good man who worked inside the constraints he had been given without fully understanding that the constraints themselves were the problem, not his effort within them. He had been taught that working harder was the answer to every difficulty. And when working harder did not produce a fundamentally different result, he concluded that the difficulty was permanent rather than that the framework was wrong. That conclusion, held by brilliant and sincere people across every generation, is what I mean when I call hard work a trap, not because the work is bad, because the belief that effort alone is the primary input to real results keeps people from examining the structure they are working within and asking whether the structure itself needs to change. Let me be precise about this because the distinction matters. Hard work produces more output of whatever the work is currently aimed at. If you are digging a ditch, working harder produces a deeper or longer ditch faster. If you are assembling parts at a production station, working harder produces more assembled parts per hour. If you are managing correspondence and working harder at it, you manage more correspondence per day. The effort translates directly into more of the existing output. This is not useless. The world requires people who execute well at specific tasks, and executing well requires genuine effort and consistency. I am not dismissing that. My company ran on the execution of thousands of people working with real effort at specific tasks. What hard work does not produce is a change in the structure that determines what the output is worth. A man who digs ditches 10% faster is still a man who digs ditches. The value of his work is determined by what the market pays for ditch digging, and working harder within that category does not change what the category pays. To change what your work is worth, you have to change the category. You have to change the structure. And changing the structure requires thinking, which is the opposite of hard work in the way most people mean that phrase. This is the core of the trap. Hard work within a category produces more of what the category pays. It does not produce wealth. Wealth comes from changing the structure of what you do so that your output multiplies beyond your effort. And that change requires a kind of thinking that hard work, especially exhausting hard work, crowds out. A man who is genuinely exhausted from 16-hour days does not have the mental space to examine whether the 16 hours are aimed at the right thing. The exhaustion is too consuming. The day is too full. The thought that the entire direction might need to change has nowhere to land. The hard work trap keeps the trap closed by filling every available hour with effort, because the effort feels productive. Because stopping the effort, even temporarily to think about the structure, feels like the opposite of productivity. And so the man who is working hardest is often the man who is least able to make the structural change that would make the work actually pay. Most people who know the story of the assembly line understand it as a production innovation, a better way to build automobiles, a more efficient arrangement of the manufacturing process. That is accurate, but it is not the full story. The assembly line was, at its core, a direct rejection of the hard work model of production. Before the assembly line, skilled craftsmen built automobiles largely by hand. These were capable men who worked with real skill and genuine effort. Building a car was complex work that required a man to understand and execute many different operations. The work was demanding, and the men who did it were legitimately skilled. And the cost of producing each car was far higher than it needed to be, because the model required each man to carry a large set of skills and to move between different operations across the course of his work. The expertise required was broad, the movement was constant, and the time consumed per unit of output was enormous relative to what was actually necessary to complete each specific task. The assembly line replaced a model built around skilled effort with a model built around systemic efficiency. Each man did one specific task repeatedly until he became extraordinarily fast and accurate at it. The expertise became narrow and deep rather than broad and shallow. The movement was eliminated. The work came to the man rather than the man going to the work. And the output per unit of human effort increased dramatically. This was not a way of making the workers work harder. In fact, it was the opposite. The work became simpler for each individual worker because each person did less variety of things. The gains did not come from more effort. They came from a structural change that made the same effort produce dramatically more output. And here is the thing that I want you to sit with. The men who built automobiles before the assembly line were working hard, genuinely hard. The assembly line did not make harder workers produce more. It made the same workers, applying the same or less effort, produce dramatically more through a structural change in how the work was organized. The limiting factor was never the effort. It was always the structure. Change the structure and the output changes without changing the effort. This is the alternative to the hard work trap. Not working less, working on the structure rather than within it. Here is a framework that I have never seen written out clearly, but that I have used to understand what I was doing and why for most of my working life. There are three fundamentally different categories of work. Most people spend almost all of their time in the first category. The men who build real wealth spend most of their deliberate time in the third. The first category is doing. This is executing a task. Physical or mental, it does not matter. You are performing an action that produces a specific output. The connection between effort and output is direct. More effort, more output. The work is bounded by time. When you stop doing, the output stops. The second category is organizing. This is arranging the doing of other people and resources. Management, planning, coordination, direction. The connection between your effort and output is less direct because your effort is multiplied by the people and resources you are organizing. When you stop organizing, the output drops, but does not necessarily stop immediately. Organized systems have some momentum beyond the organizer's personal effort. The third category is designing. This is creating or changing the structure within which the doing and the organizing happen. The connection between your effort and output is indirect and delayed, but potentially enormous. When you design a new structure, you are not producing output directly. You are changing the conditions under which output is produced. And if the new structure is better than the old one, the output improvement runs continuously, with or without your continued involvement. Most people spend almost all of their working hours in the first category. They are always doing. When they have more energy, they do more. When they are tired, they do less. The output is always directly proportional to the personal effort applied. This produces wages. It does not produce wealth. The men who build wealth, including the men I most respected in my era, spent a significant portion of their deliberate time in the third category. They were designing. Not constantly, not at the expense of the doing and organizing that kept things running, but deliberately and regularly as a protected practice. They were asking what needs to change about the structure so that the same or less human effort produces more output, and they were acting on the answers to that question. The assembly line was third category work. The $5 workday was third category work. The vertically integrated supply chain was third category work. Each of these was a structural change that altered the conditions under which production happened and produced compound improvements in output that no amount of first category effort could have generated. You cannot do third category work while you are exhausted from first category work. The mental space required for design is different from the mental space required for execution. Execution rewards full physical and mental commitment in the moment. Design requires stepping back from the moment to see the structure of the whole. These two modes are not compatible in the same hour. And when the hours are full of execution, as they are for most people who have been told that hard work is the path, the design work never happens, the structure never changes, and the output never exceeds what the effort can directly produce. Here is the first exercise. It takes 5 days and shows you something that almost everyone finds uncomfortable to see. For 5 consecutive working days, track every hour. At the end of each hour, write one sentence about what you spent that hour doing. One sentence is enough. Then mark each hour with a number. 1 for doing, 2 for organizing, 3 for designing. Do not try to spend more time in category 3 during these 5 days. Do not change anything. Simply observe and record. At the end of 5 days, count the hours in each category. What almost every person who does this exercise discovers is that their ratio is heavily skewed toward category 1. 90% or more of their working hours, in many cases, are spent in execution. Category 2 gets maybe 10%. Category 3 gets close to nothing. This is the map of where the hard work trap lives in your specific daily life. It is not an abstract concept. It is visible in the distribution of your hours across categories. The purpose of the exercise is not to feel bad about the ratio. It is to see it clearly for the first time. Because once you see it, the question becomes specific. What would I have to do differently tomorrow to protect even 30 minutes for category 3 work, not to eliminate category 1? You cannot build anything without doing, but to deliberately, on purpose, create a protected space for the work that changes the structure rather than just executing within it. 30 minutes of category 3 work per day, done consistently and aimed at a real structural question, produces more meaningful progress over a year than the same 30 minutes spent in category 1. Not because the minutes are longer, because the compound effect of structural improvements runs forward in time, making everything that follows more efficient, while category 1 work produces its output and stops when the hour ends. Here is the mental shift I want you to make, and I want to describe it in exact terms, because the vague version of it sounds good, but does not change behavior. Most people operate with the question, how much effort can I apply today? Their goal is to maximize effort, to use every available hour, to push through fatigue, to give more than they gave yesterday. This is the hard work model. Effort is the input being maximized. The alternative question is, how much output can I produce per unit of effort today? This question does not ask you to work less. It asks you to aim your work better. It treats effort as a resource to be deployed efficiently, rather than a virtue to be maximized. And it keeps the focus on output, which is what actually matters, rather than on effort, which is only valuable insofar as it produces output. When you ask the first question, every hour you are not working feels like a failure. Rest feels like theft from your future. Thinking feels like a luxury you cannot afford. The entire structure of the day is built around filling every hour with effort. When you ask the second question, rest becomes a legitimate input into the quality of tomorrow's work. Thinking becomes the highest leverage activity available because it produces structural improvements that multiply every hour that follows. The structure of the day is built around producing the most valuable output, which sometimes means doing less work per hour and more thinking per hour. I moved from the first question to the second question at a specific point in my development. I cannot give you an exact date. It was gradual, but I can tell you what drove the shift. It was the consistent observation that the men around me who worked the most hours were not producing the best results. And the consistent observation that the men who produced the best results were doing something different with their time than maximizing its fullness. They were protecting time for a different kind of work, the kind that did not produce output directly, but that changed the structure of what output was possible. That observation, repeated enough times, eventually changed the question I was asking about my own days. In 1926, I moved the Ford Motor Company to a 5-day, 8-hour work week. At the time, most factories ran 6 days a week, and many ran longer than 8-hour shifts. The standard belief was that more hours in the factory meant more production. More effort meant more output. The hard work model applied directly to industrial production. The results we saw after the transition were not what the hard work model would predict. Production per worker increased, not decreased, increased. The workers who came in 5 days a week for 8 hours each produced more per hour than the workers who had previously come in for longer shifts. The machines were maintained better because workers were less fatigued when they operated them. The error rate dropped, the quality of the output improved, and the cost per unit of production fell. This was not what the conventional wisdom said would happen. Conventional wisdom said that fewer hours meant less production. Conventional wisdom was based on the assumption that effort is the primary input to output, and that more effort, more hours, more time in the building translates directly to more production. What actually happened is that the quality of the effort, the attention and energy brought to each hour of work, was significantly improved by the reduced hours. A worker who had rested properly and was not already fatigued when he arrived brought genuinely more productive attention to each hour of work than a worker running on exhaustion. The per unit output of each hour improved enough to more than offset the hours removed. We also observed something else that surprised even me. The workers who were now working 5 days instead of 6 had an extra day each week to be in the world, to spend money, to live in a way that people with more resources lived. And the effect on their engagement with the work was real. Men who had a life outside the factory brought different energy inside it than men whose entire existence was the factory plus recovery from it. The 6-hour day experiment at another one of our facilities showed the same pattern. The relationship between hours and output is not linear. It is not even positively correlated past a certain point. There is a threshold beyond which more hours produce less output per hour, and the total production curve flattens and eventually drops even as the hours continue to rise. The hard work model assumes this threshold either does not exist or is always far off in the distance. The evidence, looked at honestly, places it much closer than most people are comfortable acknowledging. I want to stay on this point a little longer because I think most people underestimate the specific cost of fatigue in a way that directly enables the hard work trap to persist. Exhaustion has 2 costs, and most people who think carefully about the subject only account for one. The first cost is visible. When you are exhausted, you produce less per hour and make more errors. The output drops measurably. This cost is understood by most people who pay attention. The second cost is invisible. When you are exhausted, you cannot do Category 3 work. Not won't. Cannot. The mental space required to step back from the current structure and see it from outside, to ask what would need to change for this to work differently, is specifically not available to an exhausted mind. An exhausted mind can execute. It can respond. It can maintain the current pattern. It cannot generate a genuinely new approach to the structure underlying the current pattern. This second cost compounds invisibly. The person who is always exhausted from first category work is not just producing less per hour. They are spending every hour in a state that specifically prevents the structural thinking that would eventually change what each hour produces. They are trapped inside the current structure with no mental capacity left to examine or change it. The exhaustion is not just costing today's productivity, it is costing the ability to design a different tomorrow. This is the deepest form of the hard work trap. The hard work produces enough fatigue to prevent the examination of whether the hard work is aimed at the right thing. The fatigue protects the trap from being seen. Carnegie saw this clearly and said it to me once in a way that I have remembered precisely. He said that the man who works himself to exhaustion cannot examine his situation because he has spent the examining capacity on the work. He said that the great men he had known all understood that their most valuable resource was not their energy but their clarity, and that protecting their clarity sometimes meant deliberately doing less, so that the capacity to see the structure of what they were doing remained available. Think of it this way. A carpenter's most important tool is not the hammer. It is the eye that knows where to swing it. You can have the strongest swing in the county, but if the nail is in the wrong board, the strength is producing damage, not a house. Exhaustion does not dull the swing. It dulls the eye. It takes away the ability to see clearly where the effort should go. And a powerful swing aimed at the wrong place is not better than a weaker swing aimed at the right one. It is worse, because it commits more resources to the wrong direction faster. The man who protects his clarity is protecting his ability to aim. The man who maximizes his swing at the cost of his clarity is hitting harder and harder at boards that may not need to be hit at all. I resisted this for longer than I should have. There was a period in the early years when I believed that stopping was failure, that any hour not filled with work was an hour of competitive disadvantage, that the men who were succeeding were the men who were working hardest, and that the way to close the gap was to work harder. I believed this sincerely, and it cost me real time before I saw what was actually happening in the lives of the men who were building more than I was at the same stage. They were not working harder. They were working on different things and protecting the mental space to examine what they were doing with their hours. That examination was producing structural changes that no additional hour of first category effort could have produced. There is also a specific thing that happens to the quality of decisions when a man is chronically exhausted that goes beyond what I have described. It is not just that structural thinking becomes unavailable. It is that the judgment of which Category 1 tasks deserve the remaining energy also degrades. The exhausted mind cannot evaluate importance clearly. Everything urgent feels equally urgent. Everything demanding feels equally demanding. The ability to say this can wait, and this cannot is a function of clarity, and clarity is the first casualty of sustained exhaustion. The result is a man who is working very hard and working on almost everything with equal intensity, including the things that do not deserve intensity. Every arriving demand gets a response, because the exhausted mind cannot identify which demands to decline. Every small problem gets fixed personally because the exhausted mind cannot construct the structural solution that would prevent the problem from arriving again. The hard work is being spent on an increasingly random allocation of tasks, because the capacity to prioritize intelligently has been consumed by the work itself. Here is the practical replacement for the hard work mental habit. Not a single insight, but 3 specific questions that, when asked regularly, keep your effort aimed at what actually matters. The first question is, what would make this unnecessary? Take the task or category of work that is consuming the most of your current hours. Ask what would have to be true for this work to not need to happen, or to happen without your direct involvement. The question sounds strange at first, because it appears to be asking you to eliminate necessary work. What it is actually doing is forcing you to examine the current structure for its limitations. If you can imagine a version where the work is not necessary or not dependent on your personal execution, you have identified a structural opportunity, not a plan yet. An opportunity worth examining. The second question is, what is the one change that would make everything else easier, not the obvious incremental improvement? The structural change, the change to the organization, the process, the arrangement of work, that would make everything downstream of it produce better results. This question is aimed directly at Category 3 thinking. It asks for the lever, not the lifting. Every system has a leverage point where a relatively small change produces large downstream effects. The question forces you to look for it. The third question is, where is my effort producing the least return relative to other uses of the same time? This question is a resource allocation audit. You are asking where your hours are being spent for the smallest output relative to what those hours could produce if aimed differently. The answer is almost always the work that feels most urgent but is least structural. The administrative demands, the reactive responses, the Category 1 work that fills itself back up immediately after you complete it. Identifying it clearly is the first step to protecting time from it. Ask these 3 questions every week, not every day, weekly. Give them each real time, 15 minutes minimum. Written answers, not mental responses. The written answers are what matter. They surface things that the mental response keeps general and comfortable. Over time, these 3 questions will change what your hours are aimed at more reliably than any amount of additional effort. There was a man named Robert who came to work in my organization in the early years of the company, a manager in one of the administrative departments who came with a strong reputation for working hard and delivering results in his previous position. Robert lived up to the reputation. He was the first person in the building every morning and often the last to leave. He responded to every request faster than anyone around him. He never missed a deadline. He kept more detail in his head about the operation of his department than any 3 people should have been able to manage simultaneously. By the measure of pure effort, he was the best example of hard work I had ever employed. And his department was a consistent underperformer, not dramatically, not in a way that was easy to see against the force of his obvious effort, but consistently, year after year, producing results that were adequate and never more than that. The results were bounded by the structure of what he had built, and the structure never changed because he had no time to think about changing it. Every hour was committed to executing within it. I watched this for a while before I spoke to him about it. I wanted to understand the pattern before I tried to address it. What I found when I looked closely was that Robert had built a department where almost every significant decision ran through him personally, not because he was egotistical about authority, because he genuinely believed that being involved in everything was the same as making everything work well. He was working the hardest because he was doing the most. And the reason he was doing the most was that he had never designed the department to run without his constant personal involvement in it. His effort was the structural problem. He was working so hard that the structure had no pressure to improve, because the hard work was absorbing consequences that a well-designed structure would have caught and corrected automatically. Every time something went wrong, Robert fixed it personally and fast, which meant the system that produced the thing going wrong was never examined. It was just patched by Robert's effort. I eventually had a long conversation with Robert in which I asked him the question that I described earlier. What would have to be different about this department for it to produce the same results without your direct involvement in every decision? He found the question almost impossible to engage with at first. The idea of the department running without him felt like a failure, like an abdication. He had built his identity around the indispensability of his effort. Over the course of that conversation, I helped him understand that his goal was not to be the hardest working manager in the building. His goal was to produce the best departmental results. And those 2 things in his current structure were in direct conflict. His hard work was preventing the structural design that would have produced better results than the hard work alone ever could. Robert changed his approach over the following months. He spent the first hour of each day on what he called architecture, his word for the category 3 work I have been describing. He looked at what decisions were running through him that did not need to. He designed processes that could catch and correct problems without requiring his personal intervention. He reduced his involvement in first category execution and increased his involvement in designing the structures that governed execution. It was uncomfortable. It required tolerating more imperfection in the short term than his hard work habit had allowed. Within a year, his department was producing its best results in the time I had known him. He was working fewer hours than before. He had more clarity at the end of each day than he had ever had. And the department was producing results that his previous level of effort had never managed to reach. Robert's story is not unusual. It is the ordinary result of the hard work trap applied to a specific intelligent person with real ability and genuine commitment. And it is the ordinary result of the structural alternative when it is genuinely applied. The problem was never the effort. It was always the structure the effort was aimed at. There is something in this that I have not often spoken about directly, and I want to say it here because I think it matters. For years, the intensity of my work was also a way of not having to confront certain questions about the direction of what I was building. As long as I was working at full capacity, there was a built-in excuse for not stepping back and examining whether the full capacity was aimed at the right thing. The exhaustion gave me permission to defer the difficult structural questions. I was too busy to think about whether I was too busy. This is the form the hard work trap takes in people who are genuinely successful, not just struggling, not poverty-level hard work that produces survival wages. High-functioning hard work that produces real results within a structure that is not as good as it could be. The results provide enough reinforcement to keep the structure from being examined. The success validates the effort and makes the effort feel like the reason for the success, when the success could often have been significantly larger with less effort and more structural attention. I recognize this in myself during a specific period, probably around 1915 or 1916, when the company was large enough to be genuinely successful, and I found myself working harder than ever while feeling less satisfied than I had in the early years. The work was consuming, but the quality of what the work was producing felt less distinctive than it had when I was building the original structures. The effort was high, and the structural innovation had slowed. Seeing that clearly was uncomfortable, because it meant that the exhaustion I was experiencing was not the price of great work. It was evidence that I had drifted back into the first category as the default, running on the energy of what had been built through earlier structural work rather than doing the structural work required for the next level. I had to deliberately create space to think, to do Category 3 work again as a protected practice, rather than as an occasional break from execution. That deliberate protection of structural thinking time against the constant pressure of the executive demands that come with running a large organization is one of the ongoing disciplines of my work life. I say this not to make it sound impossible. It is not impossible, but it does require ongoing intention. The tendency to fill available hours with execution is very strong. The social and professional rewards for visible effort are immediate. The rewards for structural thinking are delayed and invisible until they are not. The discipline of protecting the invisible work is permanent, not something you establish once and then do not have to return to. Here is the second exercise. It is more immediately practical than the first and produces something you can begin using in the next week. Identify the one task or category of work in your current day that consumes the most hours and produces results that could theoretically be produced without your direct personal involvement. Not something you enjoy and want to keep. The thing that feels necessary, but that you have never examined for whether it could be done differently. Write a description of what this work currently is, what triggers it, what you do when you engage with it, what output it produces. Then write a description of the ideal version. What would it look like for this work to produce the same or better output with less or none of your direct involvement? This will feel speculative and possibly unrealistic. Write it anyway. The point is not to produce an immediately executable plan. The point is to clearly define the gap between the current structure and a better one. Then write 3 specific changes to the current structure that would close the gap, even partially. Changes that could be made within the next 30 days, not the full transformation. 3 concrete steps in the direction of the better structure. Do one of the 3 changes in the next week, not all 3. 1. Make one real structural change to the way this work happens, and observe the effect over the following 2 weeks. This exercise is the practice of Category 3 work applied to a real problem in your current situation. It is not theoretical. It produces an actual change in how one category of your current work operates. And the habit of doing this regularly, of regularly taking one over-consuming task and examining its structure for improvement, is how the daily proportion of Category 3 work gradually increases, and the daily proportion of unnecessary Category 1 work gradually decreases. Over time, this practice changes the composition of your work life more substantially than any increase in effort could. Not because you work less, because the work becomes better aimed. I want to redefine a word that has been misused in the context of this discussion, because the misuse is part of what keeps the trap in place. The word is productive. Most people define productive as busy. A productive day is a full day, a day where every hour was used, A day where you can look back and see that no time was wasted. In this definition, the busiest person is the most productive person, and the person who sat quietly for an hour thinking was the least productive. This definition is wrong in a specific way. Productive means producing output. Output is not activity. Output is the result that the activity generates. And the relationship between activity and output is not constant. Some activity generates enormous output. Some activity generates almost none. A day full of low output activity is not a productive day by any honest definition. It is a busy day that produced little. The genuine definition of productive is the amount of meaningful output produced per unit of time invested, not the number of hours, the output per hour. And maximizing output per hour requires examining and improving the structure of how work happens, which is category 3 work, and it requires protecting the mental clarity that structural thinking requires, which means protecting rest and recovery as inputs into productive work rather than alternatives to it. A day in which you spent 4 hours on category 3 work and 2 hours executing and produced real structural improvements that will multiply the output of the following weeks is more productive than a day in which you spent 12 hours executing and produced 12 hours of execution, even though the second day contained 3 times as many working hours. This definition of productivity is uncomfortable because it removes the comfort of measuring effort as a proxy for output. When effort is the measure, you always know where you stand. You can feel how much you have given and use that as evidence that you have done what you should. When output is the measure, the question is harder and more demanding. You have to examine whether what you did today actually produced something of value, not just whether you worked hard at it. The more demanding question is the right one, and asking it regularly, honestly, is what gradually changes the composition of your days from busy to genuinely productive. Here is where everything I have been describing converges into the single thing that separates the men who build wealth from the men who build wages. A wage is what one man's effort is worth. Wealth is what a system produces. The man who builds wealth builds systems, not instead of working. By working, for a period, to build a system that then works whether he does or not. This sounds abstract, but it is completely literal. The assembly line at Highland Park was a system. Once it was designed and built and running, it produced automobiles whether I was there or not. My effort went into designing it. The system's ongoing production did not require my ongoing personal effort. The ratio of my effort to output was no longer proportional. The system multiplied my prior effort forward in time. Every business model is a system. Every process is a system. Every arrangement of work that produces output beyond the direct effort of the person who built it is a system. And the gap between people who build wealth and people who build wages is, almost entirely, the gap between people who build systems and people who do not. Hard work, in the sense most people mean it, is the work of the man who has not yet built a system. The man who builds a system spends an intense period of category 3 work designing it, and then a different kind of effort maintaining and improving it. But he is no longer the system is the system. Most people never get here, not because they lack intelligence or capability, because the hard work model fills all available hours with category 1 execution, leaving no time for the category 3 work that would produce the system. The trap keeps itself closed. The path out is specific. Reduce category 1 time by identifying work that does not require your personal execution. Protect the reclaimed time for category 3 work, structural thinking about what needs to change. Build the structural changes incrementally. Over months and years, the composition of your work shifts. More designing, less doing. And the designing produces systems that multiply your prior effort forward in time in a way that no amount of doing ever could. This is not quick. It is not a 30-day transformation. It is a multi-year reorientation of what your working hours are aimed at. But the direction is clear, and the practice is specific. And the compound effect of getting the direction right accumulates in a way that eventually produces results that effort alone cannot. Most people who hear this message will recognize what I am describing. They will feel the truth of it. They will understand, perhaps for the first time clearly, that the hard work habit is not taking them where they want to go. And then they will go back to the full day of execution because the full day of execution is familiar and the alternative is not. Because stepping back to design is uncomfortable when execution is available. Because the social reward for visible effort is immediate and the reward for structural thinking is delayed. Because the trap is designed precisely to make itself comfortable and the alternative uncomfortable. The 5% who actually change something after hearing this message will do it in a specific small way. Not a dramatic overnight restructuring, not the full system on day one. They will find 30 minutes tomorrow, one real 30-minute block, and spend it on the first category 3 question. What is the one thing in my current work that, if restructured, would produce more output than any additional hour of doing? They will write the answer. They will write one concrete first step toward that restructuring. They will take that step in the next week. And then they will do it again the week after. That is the entire practice at the beginning. One session per week, one structural question, one concrete step, repeated. That repetition, over a year, produces a fundamentally different relationship with your working hours than 12 more months of maximizing effort within the same structure you are in today. The hard work trap is real. The alternative is real. The choice between them is available to you starting tomorrow morning. Listen to this message again tomorrow and the day after. The message will land differently each time because you will be in a different place in the practice. That is how this kind of instruction works. The words do not change. Your relationship with them does. Begin with the 5-day tracking exercise. 5 days. Mark each hour. Count the categories. See where the trap currently lives in your specific daily life. Then decide what one thing to change. Good luck!